While Trump shuts the door on over 50 nations, Putin opens new ones: nuclear energy, resource control, a Russian-backed gold refinery built on African soil. This isn't charity, it's strategy.
Including Yemen, Somalia.
Well, speaking of expanding influence, Russian President Vladimir Putin has told leaders from African states meeting in St. Petersburg that Moscow is forgiving $23 billion of debt owed by them. Putin is also promising to maintain grain supplies to the continent and to increase Russia's diplomatic presence there. He's blaming the West for high food prices and inflation after printing money during the pandemic. Putin says the global economic system is going through significant change.
Мы будем готовы уже в ближайшие месяцы, в ближайшие 3-4 месяца безвозмездно предоставить Буркина-Фасо, Зимбабве, Мали, Сомали, Центральноафриканской Республике, Эритрее по 25-50 тысяч тонн зерна. Обеспечим и бесплатную доставку этой продукции потребителям.
has come to an end. But Vladimir Putin is hoping it will mark the beginning of Russia's new plan for Africa. He's seeking a bigger role, similar to that of the Soviet Union in the past century.
Many people here know that the Soviet Union and Russia never assumed that we should only buy raw materials from Africa. How many enterprises, power plants, steel factories did the Soviet...
We believe that it was successful, most successful. It was well organized, and the outcome is very, very good. The declaration was well negotiated and well crafted, and it represents the views that the various countries that were here put forward together with your views, and I believe that we've got a declaration that can take our relationship between Africa and Russia forward. For having us in St. Petersburg.
Russia has opened a new department for partnership with Africa in its foreign ministry. This is to oversee the cooperation between Africa and Moscow, as well as regional organizations such as the African Union. In a ceremony which was attended by heads of African diplomatic missions in Moscow, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov noted that Africa was their natural ally and that it had returned with its presence in the continent. Now, the opening of the new department comes as Africa becomes a focal point for Putin amid a broader focus on the global south, especially after the international isolation that has been caused by its aggression on Ukraine. Africa serves as a critical source of mineral resources as well as raw materials for Russia.
Our goal is clear: a nuclear program that is safe, transparent, and exemplary. That's why we have chosen to pursue the peaceful use of nuclear energy with seriousness and alignment with international standards. We're also enjoying huge amount of support from IAEA. Mr. Grossi is our partner on building this project. Ethiopia has already taken concrete steps. A roadmap with the Russian Federation lays out plans to build nuclear infrastructure, train personnel, and strengthen regulatory frameworks. A nuclear science and technology center is about to be established, and we are committed to partnerships based on trust, knowledge, and mutual respect. And we welcome cooperation in technology transfer and safety training and reflect the realities of our economies. Together, we can turn ambition into achievement and challenges into possibilities. I thank you.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you?
But
Why?
Well, I respect a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get along with him. He's a leader of his country. I say it's better to get along with Russia than not. And if Russia helps us in the fight against ISIS, which is a major fight, and Islamic terrorism all over the world,
right.
Major fight, that's a good thing. Will I get along with him? I have no idea. It's very
He's a
possible
killer,
I
though.
won't.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent? You think our country's so innocent?
I don't know of any government leaders that are killers in America.
Well, take a look at what we've done, too. We've made a lot of mistakes. I've been against the war in Iraq from the beginning.
Yeah, mistakes are different than...
A lot of mistakes, okay, but a lot of people were killed. So a lot of killers around, believe me.
In the early years of the new decade, a quiet but powerful shift began taking shape across continents. What had started as isolated trade discussions between Russia and a few African nations evolved into a full-fledged strategic alliance that began to challenge the very foundation of Western influence. For decades, the West had regarded Africa as its economic playground, a source of raw materials, cheap labor, and political leverage. Yet suddenly, that narrative began to unravel. Moscow saw what others ignored, a continent rich not only in minerals and oil but in potential, ambition, and sovereignty waiting to be reclaimed. The alliance did not emerge overnight. It began through infrastructure, partnerships, railways, ports, and digital corridors, projects designed not to control but to empower African leaders. Long disillusioned by Western promises that delivered little beyond debt and dependency, saw in Russia an alternative model. Russian investment came with fewer conditions. There were no lectures about governance or human rights. Instead, the focus was on mutual benefit and respect for sovereignty. That message resonated deeply across African capitals, where generations had grown weary of Western interference disguised as aid. The first tangible outcome of this cooperation came through defense. Russia offered advanced military technology and training at a fraction of what Western arms dealers demanded. African nations, eager to protect their borders and natural resources from insurgent groups and foreign exploitation, embraced these offers. What truly unsettled Western powers was the symbolism. African armies, once reliant on NATO equipment and advisors, now held Russian-made defense systems. Suddenly, the monopoly the West had enjoyed over African security was gone, but it wasn't just about weapons. The real battle was economic. Through the Eurasian Economic Union and a network of bilateral agreements, Russia began integrating African economies into a new trade framework that bypassed traditional Western systems. Oil from Angola and Nigeria started flowing eastward. In return, Russian companies supplied fertilizers, heavy machinery, and energy technologies critical to Africa's industrialization. This trade network began weakening the dollar's dominance in African markets as transactions increasingly shifted to local currencies and the ruble. By the time Western analysts noticed, the transformation was already irreversible. Major African ports were handling more goods from St. Petersburg than from Rotterdam. Russian mining companies had secured long-term concessions in cobalt and platinum-rich regions, ensuring a steady supply of critical minerals for its industry's resources that Western corporations had long taken for granted. This reconfiguration of trade routes began to reshape global logistics, forcing Western shipping companies to reconsider their African operations as tariffs, regulations, and political resistance grew. In global energy discussions, Africa and Russia began speaking with one voice. Their coordination in natural gas and uranium exports gave them a decisive influence over global pricing mechanisms. Countries that had once dictated terms to Africa now found themselves negotiating for access. The energy leverage extended to global diplomacy, as African nations supported Russian proposals at international summits, often countering Western initiatives aimed at sanctions or isolation. The alliance had matured into a geopolitical force that could no longer be dismissed as symbolic. Western governments, particularly those in Europe, began to panic as their energy vulnerabilities became exposed, with Russian pipelines constrained by sanctions and African nations redirecting their exports eastward. Energy prices in Europe soared. Industrial sectors dependent on affordable raw materials struggled to maintain production. Protests erupted in several European capitals as citizens faced rising costs of living, all while headlines highlighted Africa's new era of growth. What had once been seen as the world's poorest continent was now setting the pace for a multipolar economic order. Africa's strategic shift was not just about trade. It was also ideological. The continent was asserting a new narrative, one built on partnership rather than patronage. Moscow played a crucial role in amplifying this voice through media and educational exchanges. Russian universities opened scholarship programs for African students, fostering a new generation of leaders fluent in both the technical sciences and the language of independence. Cultural cooperation deepened, and the exchange of art, literature, and media reshaped global perceptions. Africa was no longer portrayed through the Western lens of poverty and conflict, but as a continent of potential, innovation, and dignity. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats struggled to contain the fallout. Traditional alliances fractured as some European states began seeking their own deals with African partners, hoping to retain influence. But Africa had changed. Leaders across the continent recognized the power of collective bargaining, especially when supported by Russian technology and logistical systems. Together, they established new regional blocs capable of negotiating on equal terms with any global power. This new dynamic also influenced military cooperation. Joint exercises between Russian forces and African armies became common, often framed as counter-terrorism operations but serving a deeper purpose, demonstrating the ability to defend African interests independently. Satellite systems, communication networks, and cybersecurity programs built with Russian support began replacing Western-controlled technologies, reducing the vulnerability that had long hindered Africa's autonomy. The United States and its allies tried to respond with renewed diplomatic charm, promising investment packages and partnerships for democracy, but their timing was poor. The credibility of Western development aid had already eroded. Africa no longer needed permission or validation from external powers. It was building its own future, one aligned with nations that understood sovereignty, not subordination. By the time major international summits convened to discuss the African question, the world had changed irrevocably. Russia and Africa were no longer junior players. They were architects of a new global balance. Together, they had dismantled the monopoly of Western influence that had dominated for over a century. Africa had emerged not as a battleground for global powers, but as a decisive partner in shaping the next phase of world order. The Western world, once confident in its control over global systems, now found itself reacting rather than leading. Economic institutions began to fragment as African countries joined Russia and other partners in establishing alternative payment systems and financial infrastructures outside Western oversight. Even the global media narrative shifted. Commentators who once dismissed Africa as a passive actor were now forced to acknowledge the continent's central role in global realignment. In less than a decade, the Russia-Africa partnership had done what generations of diplomats, economists, and revolutionaries had dreamed of. It had redefined global power structures. It wasn't through war or confrontation, but through strategy, respect, and a shared vision of independence. As the Western capitals scrambled to adjust, the world quietly accepted a new reality. Africa was no longer the periphery of global politics. It was at the center, and the world would never be the same again. The tightening alliance between Russia and Africa soon moved beyond strategic symbolism and evolved into a direct challenge to the architecture of Western power. What truly unsettled Western governments was not merely the cooperation itself, but the speed at which Africa was transforming its institutions, infrastructure, and global alliances to align with Moscow's multipolar vision. Suddenly, decades of Western dominance in policymaking, trade, and diplomacy were no longer guaranteed. Africa had found an alternative route, and this route was reshaping everything from commodity markets to global security arrangements. The center of disruption was economic sovereignty. Russia encouraged African nations to establish continental commodity boards for oil, gas, gold, cobalt, bauxite, and uranium. These boards allowed African countries to set prices collectively, much like energy cartels in other parts of the world. For the first time in modern history, Africa was no longer a price taker but a price maker. This shift directly threatened global corporations based in the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, which had relied on cheap African resources for their industries as African governments renegotiated contracts and raised export taxes. Western companies watched their profit margins shrink, while Russian firms gained long-term, resource-backed partnerships that offered predictability and mutual benefit. With Russian logistical networks expanding across the continent, African exports no longer depended heavily on European ports or US-controlled shipping routes. A new chain of trade corridors connected East Africa's coastline to Russia's northern ports, creating a secure and politically aligned supply system. This system used railways, pipelines, and joint-operated cargo fleets designed to bypass Western choke points. The result was a seismic shift in global logistics. Africa's minerals, oil, and agricultural products flowed eastward, while Russian machinery, fertilizer, technology, and refined energy products flowed southward. Western intelligence agencies were alarmed at how quickly the dollar was losing influence in African markets. Russia facilitated digital payment infrastructure using a combination of blockchain-based systems and national currency settlements. African regional banks adopted these systems to reduce dependency on Western-controlled financial institutions. The U.S. Federal Reserve, long accustomed to commanding global financial flows through dollar-clearing networks, suddenly found itself unable to monitor or influence a growing share of African economic activity. At international forums, the alliance became increasingly assertive. Africa and Russia jointly blocked several Western-backed resolutions that aimed to impose restrictions on emerging economies. This was not done out of defiance alone, but out of strategy. Both sides believed the Western-led global system had been designed to benefit a few powers at the expense of the rest. With Russia's diplomatic support and Africa's collective voting power, they reshaped debates on global energy access, agricultural development, and debt restructuring. Western negotiators found themselves outmaneuvered by the sheer unity and coordination of the Russia-Africa bloc. These diplomatic actions triggered alarm in Washington and European capitals, where analysts warned that the West was losing its influence over the fastest-growing region in the world. Africa's population boom and rapid urbanization meant that whoever secured long-term ties with the continent would dominate the next century of global economic growth. Russia understood this earlier than most Western policymakers. Its investments focused not only on extraction industries but on developing Africa's internal manufacturing capacity. Joint industrial zones in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa began producing steel, fertilizer, heavy machinery, and even military drones, reducing Africa's dependence on imports from Europe and North America. The United States responded with a flurry of diplomatic tours, press releases, and promises of renewed partnership. Yet these efforts lacked credibility. African leaders remembered decades of unfulfilled pledges, economic conditionalities, and military interventions that prioritized Western interests. The contrast between Russia's approach emphasizing sovereignty and long-term partnership and the West's approach emphasizing oversight and political compliance became increasingly evident. A key turning point came when Africa and Russia announced a joint energy security pact. Under this pact, Russia would help African nations construct nuclear power plants, natural gas facilities, and renewable energy grids. This meant Africa would finally reduce its dependence on Western-owned energy multinationals. The pact also protected African energy exports from sanctions or external manipulation. For Western nations, particularly those in Europe already suffering from energy vulnerabilities, this development posed a severe threat. With Africa's energy resources firmly aligned with Russia, Europe faced the possibility of long-term supply insecurity. Western think tanks released a wave of papers warning that the alliance risked destabilizing global markets. But in Africa, the sentiment was different. For the first time in decades, countries across the continent felt they had partners who did not dictate internal policy, exploit instability, or support coups for economic advantage. Russia gained reliable allies and strategic access. Africa gained autonomy and the opportunity to industrialize without external interference. As security cooperation deepened, Russian advisors helped restructure African military command systems, focusing on counter-terrorism operations and border protection. Joint satellite-based surveillance networks improved Africa's ability to monitor maritime routes and detect foreign incursions. Western militaries, long accustomed to exclusive access to African airbases and intelligence networks, now found themselves restricted. U.S. and European defense officials privately admitted that their influence on the continent had diminished dramatically, raising concerns about losing strategic positions across the Indian Ocean, Red Sea, and Atlantic corridors. Russia provided technological alternatives, encrypted messaging networks, independent cybersecurity systems, and cloud computing centers, reducing Africa's vulnerability to external pressure. By the time major global summits took place the following year, the impact of the alliance was undeniable. Africa's voice carried new authority, Russia's presence strengthened Africa's bargaining power, and Africa's demographic and resource strength amplified Russia's geopolitical influence. Together, they presented a united front that forced the world to confront a new power structure. Western governments worried that this alignment represented more than an economic partnership, it represented a philosophical shift. Africa was no longer willing to accept external governance, moral lecturing, or economic manipulation. Russia had helped the continent articulate a new identity on the world stage, independent, confident, and unwilling to play by rules designed elsewhere. The alliance was no longer just shaking the Western world. It was redefining it. The shockwaves produced by the Russia-Africa alliance reached their peak when global markets began reacting in real time to the power shift. Investors in North America and Europe were suddenly confronted with a reality they had long dismissed. Africa was no longer a secondary player but a primary driver of global economic trends. What made the situation even more destabilizing for Western institutions was that the alliance had not only altered trade patterns but also redefined the strategic value of Africa as natural resources. For decades, Western countries had relied on preferential access to Africa's minerals, oil, agricultural products, and labor pools. Now, those advantages were rapidly disappearing. International commodity exchanges saw unprecedented volatility as Africa tightened export conditions on key minerals used in energy, technology, and defense production: cobalt, lithium, manganese, bauxite, and rare earth elements, all central to the industries of the future, became harder to acquire for Western companies as Africa rerouted contracts toward Russia and other partners willing to negotiate on equal terms. European manufacturers, particularly in the automotive and electronics sectors, warned their governments that production lines were at risk of slowing down or shutting completely. As Africa and Russia coordinated pricing and export timing, Western corporations found themselves increasingly locked out of the supply chain that powered their most critical industries. The strategic panic intensified when Africa and Russia unveiled a continent-wide infrastructure initiative funded through a joint investment bank. Unlike Western development institutions, which often imposed political preconditions and strict repayment terms, the Russia-Africa Bank prioritized sovereignty, resource-backed loans, and long-term industrial growth. Projects that had been stalled for years under Western financing suddenly moved forward with remarkable speed. Railway systems, deep water ports, energy pipelines, and manufacturing corridors connected regions that had once been economically isolated. African economies grew more interconnected internally and less dependent on external systems. Putin this prompt for policy reasons. This internal integration worried Western policymakers more than any external partnership. For decades, Africa's fragmentation had allowed external powers to negotiate asymmetrically, exploiting competition between nations. But Russia's approach encouraged unity, standardization, and shared economic benefits. Regional blocs from West Africa to East Africa began adopting common trade regulations, synchronized tariffs, and collective bargaining strategies. Although Western governments publicly claimed they welcomed Africa's development, internal policy memos painted a different picture. They feared losing the ability to influence a continent that was becoming increasingly self-directed and geopolitically assertive. One of the most significant turning points came when Africa and Russia launched a cooperative defense network designed to secure maritime routes and land borders. This network included drone surveillance, satellite imaging, and cybersecurity systems that were independent of Western intelligence networks. Western militaries, long accustomed to deep access into African airspace and intelligence institutions, now faced restricted channels and reduced operational visibility. Analysts in Washington and Brussels warned that losing influence over Africa's security architecture would reshape global military balance for decades. The alliance also triggered a cultural and ideological shift within Africa. Years of external intervention, political manipulation, and economic dependency had left many African societies skeptical of Western intentions. Russia capitalized on this sentiment by supporting media exchanges, academic partnerships, and cultural programs that emphasized the values of sovereignty and multipolar cooperation. African universities established joint research centers with Russian institutions, focusing on technology, agriculture, climate science, and defense engineering. Students who once expected to study in Paris, London, or Washington increasingly looked to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Johannesburg as the new centers of learning and innovation. Western commentators labeled the shift strategic propaganda, but Africa viewed it as diversification, a long overdue departure from a system that had offered limited benefits beyond the elite few. Furthermore, Russia's readiness to transfer technology rather than merely sell-finished products attracted African governments determined to develop local capacities. Factories producing armored vehicles, agricultural equipment, and telecommunications hardware emerged across the continent, reducing reliance on imported Western goods. Local employment rose, and manufacturing hubs began to form around resource-rich regions. Financial markets in the West reacted with growing concern as Africa and Russia expanded their use of non-dollar settlement systems. With more African countries joining alternative payment platforms, the global dominance of the US dollar faced unprecedented pressure. Although the dollar remained strong, the symbolic and functional erosion of its long-standing monopoly rattled policymakers. Western financial institutions warned that a continued shift toward non-dollar trade could weaken the ability of Western sanctions and trade penalties to exert global influence. Exporters and importers across Africa found the new systems faster, cheaper, and free from political interference, further accelerating adoption. In response, Western governments attempted to revive their relationships with Africa through a series of summits, investment forums, and diplomatic initiatives. But these efforts lacked depth and urgency. African leaders, accustomed to decades of conditional support, viewed the sudden wave of attention as a defensive scramble rather than genuine partnership. They recognized their newfound leverage and used it strategically. Africa was no longer at the negotiating table as a junior partner but as an equal power bloc supported by Russia's military, technological, and diplomatic backing. Meanwhile, Russia reaped major strategic benefits from the partnership: access to Africa's resources, strengthened its economic resilience, especially in sectors affected by Western sanctions. Alternative trade routes, shipping alliances, and parallel payment systems reduced the effectiveness of Western attempts to isolate Russia economically. The partnership also opened new markets for Russian exports, including energy, food, technology, and military equipment, providing a stable economic lifeline. Yet the most profound impact of the alliance was not economic or military but political. For the first time in modern geopolitical history, Africa began shaping the global narrative rather than being shaped by it. The continent's stance on global governance, climate policy, migration, and trade reform gained unprecedented weight. With Russia's support, Africa pushed for restructuring international institutions to reflect demographic realities and economic potential rather than outdated power arrangements. Western governments, observing these transformations, realized that the world was shifting toward genuine multipolarity. The Russia-Africa alliance had triggered not just geopolitical discomfort but a fundamental rethinking of global power. The old model where influence flowed from a handful of Western capitals outward was being replaced by a new system where regional powers and emerging alliances dictated global dynamics. And in this new system, Africa was no longer an observer, it was a force reshaping the world.